Following World War II, the US played a huge part in restructuring Japan's post-war landscape. They were the architects behind Japan's government and constitution, and even set up shop with a robust military presence right in the heart of the action. Much conjecture exists regarding the possibility that Uncle Sam may have exerted additional influence, such as establishing Japan's central bank and creating trade regulations that are weighted to their advantage. Today, the two countries have a strong relationship, and it's frequently brought up to talk about Japan's reliance on the United States. But considering Japan's past, 2 nuclear bombs from the US, it's amazing how tight these two countries have become, to the point that Japan is now considered an American colony. In this video, we'll be discussing how Japan allegedly became an American colony. Before we begin with the chapters of this video, what do you think about Japan's dependence on the United States? Let us know with some facts. Between 1899 and 1900, the United States rolled out an open-door policy for China, aiming to keep China's resources and markets open to all without falling under Japan's or any other nation's dominance. Fast forward to 1931, and the vibe got tense when Japan decided to invade China's Manchuria. The US wasn't exactly happy about that and kept watch on Chiang Kai-shek's chess moves against the Japanese invaders. Despite the United States' refusal to recognize Japan's acquisition of Manchuria diplomatically, Secretary of State Henry Stimson took a diplomatic stand under the Stimson Doctrine, pledging neither military or financial reprisals. The United States had interests in play, particularly about oil, tin, and rubber imports from Southeast Asia, which was a major supplier in the 1930s. Japan and the United States were vying for the same resources and Asian markets in these ways. Even so, the United States was cool trading with Japan despite the competition, and Japan relied on the US for 80% of its oil, as well as scrap iron, steel, and consumer products. Through naval treaties, the United States and Great Britain attempted to restrain Japan's naval fleet in the 1920s, but they didn't cut off Japan's oil supply. Events like the Nankin Massacre and the attack on the US gunboat Panay put a dent in the once chummy vibe between the US and Japan. Later on, the US, Australia, and Britain hit Japan with trade embargoes. In the mid-30s, to keep the country from selling stuff to nations at war, the US Congress threw in the Neutrality Act. President Roosevelt wasn't a fan, but still signed them. Weirdly, these acts only kicked in if he said so, and he didn't for Japan and China. He was more into helping China out. By 1939, the US decided enough was enough. They bid the Treaty of Commerce and Navigation with Japan farewell, hinting at the end of their trade relationship. Then, in 1940, Roosevelt hit Japan with a partial embargo on oil, gas, and metals. This move left Japan in a tight spot. They weren't ready to stop their empire expansion, and with the looming threat of a full embargo, they started eyeing the Dutch East Indies for oil. But there was an issue. The US controlled Philippines and the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Fast forward to July 1941, the US pulled the plug, completely embargoing resources and freezing Japanese assets. So, trade trouble with Tokyo had Roosevelt and Congress on edge by 1937, and it was from here that things took a dramatic turn. The Japanese were keeping their fingers crossed, hoping they could talk their way out of the embargo mess with the US. But that dream took a nosedive on November 26, 1941, thanks to US Secretary of State Cordell Hull and his infamous Hull Note. The note basically said, "Want your resources back? Easy, just do these 3 things. Pull your troops out of China, pack up from Indochina, and break up with Germany and Italy." Japan couldn't accept those terms, and just as Hull was dropping the bombshell, Japanese naval forces were already making a beeline for Hawaii and the Philippines. The stage was set, and within days, World War II in the Pacific kicked off. With the US cutting off Japan's oil supply and their reserves running low, Japan decided to go for it by bombing Pearl Harbor, the US naval base in Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. The plan was to temporarily cripple the US, affording Japan the window to establish a robust presence in Southeast Asia and fortify strategic buffer zones. But they ended up dragging the US into World War II on the side of the Allies. On April 1, 1945, almost 4 years after these events, the United States invaded the Japanese island of Okinawa. The Allies considered Okinawa a strategic point for invading Japan's main islands in the last stages of World War II. On August 6, America dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, they repeated the devastating move, dropping the second bomb on Nagasaki. This 1-2 punch effectively brought an end to the war. In 1945, Japan surrendered to the US after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the declaration of war by the Soviet Union. Following this was the occupation of Japan by the Allied powers, led mainly by the US crew, with General Douglas MacArthur calling the shots for 7 years. During the occupation, Japanese soldiers and civilians abroad were brought back to Japan. Arms industries were dismantled and political prisoners were released. War crimes trials were conducted, resulting in the execution of 7 wartime leaders, and the Meiji Constitution was replaced by a new constitution in 1947, establishing a democratic government. The new constitution covered various topics, including land reform, women's suffrage, free speech, assembly, religion, labor unions, and the adoption of US-style education systems. Article 9, a pivotal element, renounced military aggression, expressing Japan's sincere aspiration for international peace based on justice and order. Basically, they put a big red X on keeping arms, navies, and air forces, plus any other war toys. Despite its intention to maintain peace, Article 9 created an unequal power dynamic. The occupying power's military force expanded, while that of the occupied nation remained stagnant. As the Korean War kicked off, the US, a big player in setting up the Constitution, wanted to find ways around its rules. Japan, feeling the pressure, decided to beef up its military and slyly called it Self-Defense Forces to slip past the Constitution, thanks to the North Korean scare. This move made a lot of Japanese folks uneasy, thinking it violated the Constitution and ditched the post-war commitment to peace. But at the heart of it, the US and Japan teaming up was mostly about facing the Cold War and their joint fear of the big, bad communism wolf. Japan signed a security treaty for a peace of reconciliation in San Francisco in 1951, and the American occupation of Japan wrapped up in 1952. The treaty allowed the US to keep military forces in Japan, with Okinawa separated from the rest of Japan and still under US rule. In the 1950s, anti-US military feelings flared up in mainland China after a US soldier fatally shot a Japanese woman. The US military decided to move its bases from the mainland to Okinawa. It eased the frustration in mainland but dropped a burden on the people of Okinawa. In 1960, they shook things up with a revised US-Japan agreement, giving the United States the green light to set up many military bases on the archipelago in exchange for a promise to defend Japan if attacked. These bases marked the US military's first permanent spot in Asia. In 1967, Prime Minister Eisaku Sato established the 3 non-nuclear principles. These principles outlined Japan's commitment to not possessing, producing, or introducing nuclear weapons. This move aimed to address concerns about the presence of nuclear arms on US bases in Japan, which could make the country vulnerable to attacks. By 1972, Okinawa returned from US rule and fell under Japanese administration. However, even before this transfer, the US military had already constructed extensive bases in Okinawa. Today, approximately 70% of all US facilities in Japan are still concentrated in Okinawa. Since then, Japan has leaned on the US nuclear umbrella. It has strategically utilized US-backed free trade schemes, capitalized on American military strength, and drawn from their shared experiences to deter potential aggressors. The U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense reports that Japan hosts more U.S. military personnel than any other country. The sheer number of military bases the U.S. has in Japan challenges the notion of Japan's full sovereignty. Additionally, the significant U.S. military presence positions America to wield considerable influence over Japan's international policies. As the alliance strengthens, there's a possibility that Japan has compromised its independence, contributing to the precipitation of Japan as a de facto colony of the USA. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.